join me in welcoming Paula Simons, our outspoken advocate of multiculturalism and cultural inclusion, to the podium. I give you Paula Simons.
Yes, should I actually take it off here? Is that better? Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much, Mr. Stilios, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to let our... Thank you. That'll help. And this will work for the video if I'm using the handheld mic? Excellent. Je suis heureuse d'être ici and honored to be here this afternoon on Treaty 6 land and on the traditional territory of the Cree people to speak to you about the true Alberta advantage, multiculturalism. And I think it's very important that we begin by acknowledging that we are all Treaty 6 people today. It is that treaty which binds us, whether we are citizens of First Nations or whether we are settlers or the descendants of settlers in this beautiful place, whether our families arrived here 150 years ago or last year, whether we are the newest kind of Canadian or the oldest. The real privilege that we have is to share this place together. And it's not a privilege any of us should take for granted. We need to start by acknowledging our First Peoples and our often painful and guilty colonial past, because I think our very unique form of local multiculturalism begins at the very beginning of Edmonton's history. From the very first days of settlement here, I think I'm going to come, no, I'm going to run your shop then. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stop being obnoxious. From the very first days of settlement here, this was a multicultural community. And the first visitors to write about their time here remarked with wonder at all the different languages spoken at the Fort Edmonton Trading Post. Cree, Dene, Blackfoot for starters, mixed with English and French, but also with Scots Gaelic and Welsh. Of course, they weren't always impressed by what they found here. When Jim Gibbons, an Anglo-Irish prospector and buffalo hunter, arrived here in the late 1860s, he was quite baffled by what he found. "This is the queerest place I've ever been in," he wrote to his friend Malcolm Grote, a Hudson's Bay Company trader. I don't think queer meant then what we do now. "It's a perfect babble of tongues. Cree, French, and Gaelic. Is there no place in these British possessions where us Englishmen can speak our own language?" Good thing he's not here today. Still, Jim's discomfort aside, we were a polyglot and multilingual place from the moment Edmonton was first called Edmonton. And until 1885, in fact, Francophones outnumbered Anglophones in these parts, and until 1885, white Western Europeans were the minority population here. That wasn't the history I was taught in school. Perhaps it's not the history you learned either. Our history put rather a lot of stress on our British imperial roots, to be sure, and glossed over the ugly side of that colonial past. But that superficial imperial narrative never really rang true here. Because from the very, very beginning, this was a meeting place where people from around the world convened to redefine themselves and to find new beginnings. This is not a place that had 2 founding nations. It's a place that started with about a dozen. Some came to seek their fortune. Some came fleeing poverty and injustice. Others came fleeing war and reaching for peace. But whether they were looking for adventure and profit or for peace and security, getting here was always a risk, much harder than getting to the Nova Hotel off the Yellowhead. Getting here always takes an effort. In fairness, it still does. But if you think it takes a long time to fly here from Lagos or Mumbai or Santiago or Beijing, imagine what it took to get here before there was a railway. Moving here to latitude 53, beyond the 100th meridian, has always taken courage, imagination, and a certain crazy degree of desperation. Coming to Edmonton has never been for the faint of heart. There have always been easier places to reach and gentler climates to survive. And still, over generations, people, bold and visionary and slightly mad people, have come here to build new lives and new communities in this brave new world. And we've done it together. It wasn't so very long after those first French and English and Scottish and Welsh settlers arrived that they were followed in the 1880s by the first German and Chinese and Scandinavian and Jewish and Ukrainian pioneers. The very first black settlers fleeing the American South and the legacy of slavery arrived at about the same time, and the first Syrian and Lebanese settlers got here not long after that, to be followed by the first Sikhs, the first Italians, the first Japanese, and the first Greeks. My point? Settlers of different faiths and different skin tones all got here at more or less the same time, give or take a decade. And despite what my textbook said, this was never simply a Christian place or a white place. Well, in the winter, it's always a white place. This was a place that in its very genesis and in its very DNA was always, always, always heterogeneous and always heterodox. We never played by the rules. Multiculturalism? In Edmonton, that word was never just some politically correct marketing slogan, some new age bit of condescending, patronizing jargon. Multiculturalism here is real, and it's true. And it's one of the reasons that Alberta, yes, redneck Alberta, actually led the charge nationally to redefine Canada as a multicultural nation state way back when Justin's dad was Prime Minister. Does that mean that Alberta was ever some kind of racism-free utopia, or that it ever will be? Sadly, no. This is the real world. It's not the small world ride at Disneyland. Universal human failings, xenophobia, greed, prejudice, paranoia, and hatred are not so easily vanquished. And yes, we as Albertans and Canadians need to own up to our dark side. We need to acknowledge the original sins of this place, the colonization and displacement of its first peoples, the attempts to restrict their freedom with reserves, then to erase their languages and cultures through residential schools, and later through the annihilation of Métis settlements. As the death of Leilani Muir O'Malley this week should remind us, we also need to acknowledge Alberta's history of eugenics, a program to sterilize those deemed unworthy to breed, which disproportionately targeted Indigenous people and new immigrants, the outsiders and the marginalized who didn't speak enough English to pass their government-mandated IQ tests. And of course, we need to acknowledge that successive waves of immigrants have faced hostility and distrust and economic marginalization in every generation, and that they still do. We need to acknowledge that for all our fine worlds and our fine festivals, we still have a ways to go in our quest for social justice and economic inclusion. And yet, when we go looking for flaws and failings and focus only on them, we can forget the quite miraculous things we have actually accomplished here. We're gathered here today to celebrate multiculturalism, but around this world, the ideal it represents is under siege. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel has already declared Germany's approach to Multikulti a failure. Die Ansatz für Multikulti ist gescheitert, absolut gescheitert, sie hat gesagt. And in France and England, we're seeing the rise of far-right ultranationalist parties which have moved from the fringes of politics to the mainstream, a transition that started even before waves of migrants and refugees from Northern Africa and the Middle East started to arrive. Closer to home, we need only look south of the border to see the disturbing rise of Donald Trump, the poor man's fascist, a confidence man who seems to delight in stirring up xenophobia and racism, not so much out of deep ideological conviction, but out of malicious mischief. Trump, with his sneering insinuations against Muslims and Mexicans, against the Chinese, against African Americans, is preying on what you might call white fragility, on the fears and disappointments of middle-class white Americans who are worried that their privileged access to the American dream is slipping away. Trump, of course, is encouraging Americans to be afraid of poor illegal immigrants, of those alleged criminals and terrorists sneaking over America's borders. But I think he is also, more subtly, but just as successfully, preying on Middle America's fears that of successful immigrants and the successful children of successful immigrants, that they will outcompete them and their kids. In other words, Trump's followers aren't just afraid of boogeyman immigrants who can't or won't successfully immigrate. They are also resentful of immigrant success stories, of the immigrant kids who might beat their kids in piano competitions or soccer games, or in the fight for admission to first-class universities, or in the competition for jobs after graduation. I think during our own recent federal election campaign, Stephen Harper tried, on a more modest and less Trumpian scale, to play that game. and Canadians told him they weren't interested in playing. And in the face of all this, I think it's more important than ever that Canada in general and Alberta in particular present themselves to the world as examples of how multiculturalism can, at its best, work. We have not reached nirvana, and sometimes even the most well-meaning of us put our feet in our mouths. My feet are there a lot. We say stupid and hurtful things even without meaning to, because we're still learning from one another. Still, I think we can stand as a role model to the world of how to create a peaceful, tolerant, and inclusive multicultural society with access to opportunity. And we can think about what makes our multiculturalism so different from the failures in Germany and France, what makes Edmonton's multiculturalism different from the variations you see in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal. One thing that makes multiculturalism work here in Edmonton, I think, is that it's part of our foundational myth. Because we've been so diverse since the beginning, I think we're more skilled and practiced at integrating new arrivals. Immigrants and refugees don't challenge our sense of what it means to be Edmontonian, because our sense of identity has never been homogenous. And how can I put this? Because for us in Edmonton, multiculturalism wasn't primarily about skin pigment, but about culture. It was about celebrating Dutch or Irish or Croatian or Icelandic or Greek culture every bit as much as it was about celebrating the culture of Afghanistan or Fiji or Kenya or Honduras or Korea. It was never about them and us or honoring the other, because we are they and they are us, and if everybody is other, then nobody is. We have always allowed for difference here and celebrated it, because it's hard to have one dominant culture if everyone is different. I think the other thing, though, that we've had going in our favor has been equality of opportunity. Albertans were not particularly surprised when Calgary elected a Harvard-educated Indo-Canadian Muslim mayor from Tanzania. It was the national media who reacted, oh my gosh, you have Muslims in Alberta. Oh my gosh, you elect them to office. Yes, Toronto Star, you can calm down now. Similarly, Edmontons were not particularly amazed when Amarjeet Sohi, a Sikh former transit driver, became Canada's Federal Minister of Infrastructure. That's what we expected. I do have to say, I was a little bit surprised when my daughter's junior high debate teammate, Don Mustang, became Edmonton MLA last year. That's not because he's the son of Vietnamese refugees, but because he just turned 20. We haven't had your 21st birthday yet, have we? No. Soon Thomas will be legal to drink in all of North America, but not yet. And your mother asked me to check. Yeah, poor Thomas. I've known him since he was in the 8th grade, which is really not that long ago. Yeah, okay, that's enough now. Thank you. Edmonton is blessed to be free of the kind of entrenched power elites, the family compacts that dominate older Canadian cities. You don't need a particular last name or a particular old money pedigree to succeed here. We haven't exactly achieved true equality of opportunity, but no one needs to feel that he or she is indelibly excluded from power or achievement because they don't have the right last name. And perhaps because no settler here is really truly old stock, we welcome newcomers more easily, I contend, because their stories resonate so closely with our own. My Russian-German mother, a child of the Second World War, came to Alberta as a refugee herself in the late 1940s. My father was born here, but his parents were Jewish immigrants who came to Alberta fleeing the poverty and religious persecution of the Russian Pale. Certainly, as others have mentioned, the recent Syrian refugee crisis has shown us Canada and Alberta at their very best. I love the stories we've seen of the former refugees from Vietnam and other places who are raising funds to sponsor Syrian newcomers. And I love the story I heard just this week about the Bent Arrow Traditional Aboriginal Healing Society working with the Mennonite Center for Newcomers to hold traditional Cree welcome ceremonies for Syrian refugees to introduce them to the richness of Indigenous music and culture. And I love the way that severely normal Albertans from Peace River to Lethbridge are opening their communities to these newcomers. In some ways, and bear with me here, it reminds me of a story I like to tell about my husband, who is not with us today, so I can make fun of him while I like. Moments after I gave birth to our daughter, my husband whipped out his cell phone, as men do in these circumstances, and from the delivery room called one of our dearest friends to report the safe arrival of our child. I was lying there, a natural childbirth warrior, 12 hours of back labor without benefit of any anesthetic. "How did it go?" our friend asked my husband. "It was effortless," said my husband. "Absolutely effortless." Yeah. I've never let him forget that fact. It was indeed relatively effortless for him, since his major job was to hold my hand and give me sips of ginger ale. As the person who had pushed out the baby, effortless would not have been the word I used to describe the experience. And so, despite all the media reports that make the arrival and integration of these Syrian newcomers look so happy and easy, no, it will not be effortless. People are working very hard to make this resettlement a success, yet there are no guarantees that every family will settle happily. These are people who are coming here fleeing war, they're traumatized and displaced and homesick and naturally resentful of what has happened to them. We cannot expect them to make a completely smooth and effortless transition. Like other refugee communities before them, they will suffer from culture shock and cultural dislocation as they struggle to learn a new language, to find affordable housing, to find work at a time when oil, we're celebrating that it hit $40 a barrel. But my prediction is that they will make a smoother transition than might be imaginable here than anywhere else, and that they'll be more likely to find the peace and stability they crave here than anywhere else. Their gift to us, meanwhile, their gift to us is that they've reminded us what it really means to be Canadian and helped us to remember to be grateful for what we've built here together. And no, it has not been effortless. And it won't be effortless to take the next steps, the long, hard steps of real truth and real reconciliation that give social justice and economic opportunity to Indigenous and Métis Albertans, that make us all live up to our treaty obligations and allow us to honor and embrace the resilience and the beauty of Indigenous culture. And yet, pick up a newspaper. Please, pick up my newspaper. Or pick up your smartphone and look at the news of the world, and then judge for yourself what we've accomplished here. Multiculturalism is under siege and failing in other places because they have never really understood what it was, its transformative power, and just how brave and disruptive and creative multiculturalism can be. In other places, they think of multiculturalism as a way to keep newcomers and others, the different ones, the outsiders, slightly in their place, separate and apart. We have defined it differently, as a way to synthesize something entirely, subversively new together. Look at this vibrant, dynamic, resilient city we've shaped together. A city full of great restaurants, great theater, great artists, great musicians, great festivals, great writers. Our cosmopolitan diversity is what makes Edmonton such an exciting, evolving place to live. I think our diversity is part of what makes us so entrepreneurial, too. We are not a city of head offices, but of adventurers and risk takers, of courageous, indomitable people with a ferocious work ethic and will to achieve. I think our identity as an immigrant city is a huge part of what's given us that drive, that ambition, that burning need to prove ourselves and not just to our parents. My Jewish dad likes to tell a joke about a mystical rabbi, rather given to metaphorical musings, who was teaching a class of eager bar mitzvah boys. Life, the rabbi told them, life is like a waterfall. The 12-year-old boys sat thoughtful for a moment. Finally, one of them asked, "Rabbi, why is life like a waterfall?" The rabbi thought for a moment and then shrugged. "So life is not like a waterfall." For years we were told that America was a melting pot and Canada was a mosaic. But I don't think that metaphor really captures it. It's true, a melting pot blends everything together into one new homogeneous goo where you can't tell the component bits apart. So Canada is not like a melting pot. But the mosaic metaphor, where each tile of a different color stands on its own, but makes a beautiful picture when seen from a distance. That's never seemed quite right to me either, especially not now in 2016. I've been thinking about this, and I think maybe a big steaming bowl of butter chicken poutine is the best metaphor. I want you to think about this. Component bits from around the world and across the country, which retain their own color and flavor, combined, a little bit melty, a little bit not so melty, combined to make something new and messy and rich and delicious, something newly authentic, which you would truly only find in Canada. And so, mesdames et messieurs, félicitations. Congratulations. Mazel tov. Look around this room and ask you if there's another country where you could find such a brunch, where people would take what we have here so much for granted. Effortless? No. Edmonton, this is not effortless. Labor pains never are. But we've given birth here to a new kind of city, a city that can stand as a model for others in this complex, complicated time, and as a model for ourselves if we can fully honor and acknowledge our complicated past, as we commit for our future to becoming the just, most exciting, most remarkable Edmonton we can be, reaching for peace together. Thank you very much.